The ruthless Alpha King had destroyed 3 rival wolf territories. Warriors feared him. Kings negotiated with him carefully. Entire villages fell silent when his wolves passed through. Yet on a frozen road outside Ashford village, a starving child stopped his army. She held out one small coin and asked the most feared Alpha in the northern territories to help find her father. The soldiers expected punishment. Instead, the ruthless Alpha King slid from his warhorse and dropped to his knees in the snow before the freezing child. At that moment, no one understood why. Not the soldiers, not the villagers, not even the Alpha King himself. But his wolf did, because the child standing before him carried something the wolf kingdoms had not seen for centuries. Something ancient, something powerful, and the Alpha King's wolf recognized it instantly, even if Alaric Stormclaw did not. Helping her would change the fate of every wolf territory in the north. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It truly means a lot to me. I'm working toward 1,000 subscribers, and if Brielle's story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for Ella's Alpha Romance, smash the like button, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Alright, thank you. Now let's return to the moment a freezing child unknowingly made the most feared Alpha King in the north kneel before her. Snow had fallen through the night across the valley of Ashford. By morning, the road leading toward Thornridge Pass looked like a white ribbon winding through the dark pines. Most travelers had already taken shelter inside the village taverns and stone houses. The wind that rolled down from the Frostborn Mountains could peel warmth from a body in minutes. But one small figure remained outside. Brielle Stormleaf stood beside a cracked stone milestone at the edge of the road. The wind tugged at her thin cloak. Her boots were split at the seams, letting icy slush seep through the wool wrappings around her feet. Her fingers were red from the cold. Still, she did not move. She had been standing there since sunrise, and the day before that, and the day before that. Villagers had stopped trying to convince her to leave. At first they spoke kindly. A baker had offered her bread. A merchant woman had tried to guide her toward the warmth of the village hall. But Brielle had only shaken her head. Her father had given her instructions, clear ones, and Brielle Stormleaf took promises seriously. 3 winters earlier, before the war began, her father had knelt in front of her on this exact road. He had worn his soldier's cloak that day, the dark gray one lined with wolf fur at the collar. The fabric had smelled like pine smoke and iron. She remembered his large hand resting on her shoulder. His voice had been quiet. Listen carefully, Brielle. Her father never spoke softly, unless something important was coming. When the war ends, he said, wait right here on this road. He tapped the milestone beside them. I will always find you. Brielle nodded. Her father had never broken a promise, so she waited. 3 days had passed since word spread that the war was over. The wolves of Ironhowl territory had defeated the last enemy stronghold beyond Thornridge. Peace had returned. The tavern in Ashford overflowed with soldiers celebrating their survival. Families hung lanterns outside their doors, but Brielle stood beside the milestone, waiting. Some villagers whispered when they passed. Poor child. The soldier must be dead. No one survives 3 years of war. Brielle ignored them. Her father was not like other soldiers. He was strong, and be careful, and very good at keeping promises. She held a single coin in her mitten. It was dull from years of handling. Her father had given it to her when she was small. Always pay people for good work, he used to say. So Brielle had a plan. If she found someone strong enough, someone important enough, she would hire them to help find him. Simple. The wind rose sharply across the road. Snow swirled around Brielle's legs. She shifted her weight, stamping her feet gently to keep them warm. Then she felt it, a tremor in the ground. At first she thought it was thunder rolling down the mountain slopes, but the sky was pale and still. Then she heard the sound. Wolves. Low, powerful howls echoing through the forest. Heads turned all across Ashford village. Doors opened, then quickly shut again. A merchant woman grabbed her son's arm and pulled him away from the road. Inside, she whispered urgently, now. Brielle looked toward the northern ridge. Shapes moved through the falling snow. Large shapes. Wolves. Massive gray bodies pacing beside armored riders. The Ironhowl army. Villagers scattered away from the road. Some pressed themselves against stone walls. Others lowered their heads respectfully. Because riding at the center of the formation was the man every wolf territory feared. Alaric Stormclaw, the Alpha King of Ironhowl, the conqueror of the Northern War. His black warhorse towered above the others, steam rising from its nostrils as it walked. Alaric himself sat straight in the saddle, his dark cloak snapping in the winter wind. A long scar crossed his jaw, another ran through his eyebrow. His green eyes scanned the road ahead with quiet intensity. No one stepped in his path, no one except Brielle. The child took 3 determined steps forward into the middle of the road. The wolves slowed instantly. One of the riders swore under his breath. Gods. Rowan muttered quietly. The army halted. Alaric Stormclaw looked down and saw a small girl standing in the snow. Her cloak hung crookedly over thin shoulders. Her boots were falling apart, yet she stood straight, looking directly at him without fear. Brielle tilted her head politely. "Excuse me." The soldiers stared. No one spoke to the Alpha King like that, ever. Brielle lifted her mittened hand. Inside it was a single coin. "Have you seen my papa?" Silence spread across the road. Snow drifted slowly around them. The soldiers looked at one another. Magnus Blackmore leaned toward Rowan and whispered, "She just hired the Alpha King." Brielle studied Alaric carefully. "If you find him quickly," she added thoughtfully, "you can keep the change." For a moment no one moved. Alaric Stormclaw stared down at the child. Something strange stirred inside him. His wolf shifted beneath his skin. A deep instinct pulled at him. Old. Ancient. His mind did not understand it, but his wolf did. Before he could stop himself, Alaric Stormclaw swung down from his horse. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The soldiers watched in stunned silence. Then the Alpha King of Ironhowl lowered himself to one knee in the snow before Brielle Stormleaf, and the entire army forgot how to breathe. For a long moment the world stood still. Snow drifted slowly through the air. Warriors sat frozen in their saddles. The most feared Alpha King in the Northern Territories was kneeling in the snow before a small girl. Rowan Frostborn rubbed his face. "I feel like I should blink," he muttered. Magnus Blackmore shook his head slowly. "If you blink," he said quietly, "you might wake up and realize this actually happened." Brielle looked at Alaric Stormclaw with polite curiosity. Up close he was enormous. His shoulders were as broad as a doorway. A heavy wolf fur cloak rested across his armor. The scar on his jaw looked like it had come from something with very large teeth, but his eyes were not cruel. They were tired. "I'm very tired." Brielle held her coin out again. "You can keep the change," she reminded him seriously. Behind her, several soldiers coughed suddenly, trying not to laugh. Alaric did not smile, but something inside his chest shifted slightly. He studied the child more carefully. Her cloak was threadbare. Her hands trembled in the cold. Snow clung to her hair. "How long have you been standing here?" he asked quietly. Brielle thought about it. 3 days, she answered. Rowan let out a slow breath. Magnus muttered something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. Alaric's jaw tightened. "Where are your parents?" "My papa is coming back from the war," Brielle said confidently. She pointed down the road. "He promised." A silence passed between them. The Alpha King knew every unit that had marched through Thornridge Pass. He knew how many soldiers had survived, and how many had not. But Brielle's eyes held nothing except simple faith. Alaric looked away briefly, then back again. "What is your father's name?" "Stormleaf," Brielle said. The name meant nothing yet. Not to Alaric. But something about it stirred faintly in the back of his memory. Brielle watched him carefully. "You are very tall," she observed. "Thank you. And your horse is also very tall." Alaric glanced behind him. The black warhorse snorted proudly. Brielle nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Why is that good?" "If we have to look for my papa," she explained patiently, "it will be faster." Behind them, Rowan leaned his forehead against his saddle. "She has a plan," he whispered. Magnus sighed, "and we are apparently part of it." Alaric looked at Brielle again. The cold wind was cutting through the road like a blade. The child's boots were soaked through. "Come with me," he said finally. Brielle blinked. "Where?" "To Ironhowl Fortress." She considered this carefully. "But what if my papa comes back while I'm gone?" Alaric rested one large hand against the milestone beside her. "If your father passes this road," he said calmly, "my soldiers will tell him where you are." Brielle studied his face. "Do you promise?" The Alpha King of Ironhowl did not make promises lightly, but the strange instinct inside him, the voice of his wolf, pushed the words forward. "I promise." Brielle nodded once. "All right." Then she lifted both arms. Alaric frowned slightly. "What are you doing?" "You are supposed to carry me," she explained. Rowan choked on his own breath. Magnus turned away and pretended to examine the snow. The Alpha King of Ironhowl looked down at the tiny girl. Then slowly, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. The soldiers watched in stunned silence as their king placed the child carefully onto the saddle in front of him. Brielle sat upright with great seriousness. "This is good," she said. Alaric mounted the horse behind her. Why is it good? Because now we are already traveling, she replied. Rowan covered his face with one hand. The army began moving again. Massive wolves padded beside the riders through the snow. Brielle leaned slightly forward in the saddle. Your wolves are very big, she said. They are battle wolves. They look like they need names. They already have names. Brielle nodded approvingly. That is responsible. Rowan glanced at Magnus. Responsible, he repeated quietly. Magnus stared straight ahead. I am afraid to ask what happens if we are irresponsible. The road wound north toward the dark peaks surrounding Ironhowl Fortress. Hours passed. The army moved through pine forests and frozen valleys. Eventually, Brielle shifted slightly in the saddle. Alaric noticed. Are you cold? A little. Without a word, he removed his heavy wolf fur cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders. The cloak swallowed her completely. She looked down at herself. This is a very large blanket, she announced. It is a cloak. Still useful. Alaric said nothing. But Rowan saw the expression on his king's face. It was not the expression of a conqueror. It was the expression of a man remembering something. By late afternoon, the army reached the mountain road. High above the valley stood the stone walls of Ironhowl Fortress. Tall towers rose against the winter sky. Massive gates opened slowly. As the soldiers approached, inside the fortress courtyard, warriors and servants hurried forward to greet their returning king. They stopped abruptly when they saw the small figure sitting in front of him on the horse. Brielle waved politely. Hello. Several soldiers stared as if they had forgotten how to breathe. One of the fortress wolves padded forward curiously. The enormous creature stood nearly as tall as Brielle when she slid down from the saddle. She reached into the pocket of her cloak, pulled out a small piece of bread, and held it toward the wolf. Would you like some? Rowan inhaled sharply. That wolf once bit a man in half, he whispered. The wolf gently took the bread, then sat beside Brielle. Another wolf approached, then another. Within moments, 5 massive battle wolves sat calmly around the child. Dorian blinked slowly. I have trained those wolves for 10 years. Silas crossed his arms. And they have ignored every command I ever gave. Brielle shrugged. I asked nicely. Rowan looked at Magnus. Magnus looked at Rowan. We should have tried manners, Rowan said quietly. Across the courtyard, Alaric Stormclaw watched the scene. His wolf stirred again inside him. Something ancient moved through the air around the child. Something powerful. Something the Alpha King did not yet understand. But one thing had already become clear. The moment Brielle Stormleaf stepped onto that frozen road, everything had begun to change. Winter light poured across the stone towers of Ironhowl Fortress. The fortress stood high above the valleys of Blackmoor and Nightvale, carved directly into the mountain cliffs like the den of some ancient creature. Snow clung to the battlements. Smoke drifted from tall chimneys. Warriors moved across the courtyard carrying weapons, supplies, and banners, celebrating the end of the war. But inside the fortress, not everyone was celebrating. Princess Elsinore Nightvale stood near the tall balcony windows of the council hall, watching the courtyard below. Her hands rested calmly in front of her. Her posture was flawless. Her expression revealed nothing, yet inside her chest burned a quiet storm. 3 months earlier, her kingdom had surrendered. The war had lasted 3 brutal winters. Villages burned, armies shattered, families are broken. And at the center of that destruction had been one name, Alaric Stormclaw, the Alpha King of Ironhowl. To secure peace between the territories, a treaty had been signed. The terms had been simple. Elsinore Nightvale would marry the conqueror. She would become his Luna, a symbol that the defeated kingdom of Nightvale now stood beside Ironhowl instead of against it. The thought alone made her jaw tighten, because in Elsinore's mind, Alaric Stormclaw was not simply a ruler. He was the man she believed had taken her brother's life on the battlefield. A knock sounded behind her. Princess, said a soft voice. Elsinore turned slightly. Nalia, one of the fortress attendants, stood in the doorway. The Alpha King has returned. Elsinore's expression did not change. Of course he has. She had expected the announcement. The entire fortress had been preparing for his arrival since dawn. Nalia hesitated. There is something unusual. Elsinore raised one eyebrow. Involving the Alpha King, that would not surprise me. Nalia struggled to choose her words carefully. He arrived with a child. Elsinore blinked. A child. Yes. The princess turned slowly toward the balcony. Below, the courtyard bustled with activity. Servants hurried across the stone ground. Soldiers returned to their posts. And near the center of the courtyard stood the Alpha King himself. He was easy to recognize. Alaric Stormclaw towered above nearly every warrior around him. Dark hair rested loosely around his shoulders. A long cloak of wolf fur hung across his back. Even from a distance, his presence carried the quiet authority of a predator. Elsinore had only seen him once before during the peace negotiations. That single meeting had been enough. The memory of his steady gaze still lingered, but what captured her attention now was not the king. It was the small girl standing beside him. Brielle Stormleaf was kneeling beside one of the fortress battle wolves. The enormous animal sat calmly while she fed it a piece of bread. Another wolf approached, then another. Within moments, the courtyard looked like a gathering of mountain wolves surrounding a single child. Elsinore leaned forward slightly. "What is she doing?" Nalia answered quietly. "Apparently feeding them. Those are battle wolves." "Yes." Elsinore stared. The wolves of Ironhowl were famous across the northern territories. They were raised for war, trained from birth to obey only the strongest commands. Even experienced warriors kept their distance, yet Brielle scratched one behind the ear. The wolf leaned happily into her hand. Elsinore turned slowly. "Explain." Nalia shook her head. "No one understands it yet." Below them, Rowan Frostborn and Magnus Blackmore stood nearby watching the same strange scene. Rowan folded his arms. "I have trained those wolves for years." Magnus nodded. "They once chased Silas across the entire courtyard." Silas, who happened to be standing nearby, frowned. "That was a misunderstanding." Rowan pointed. "Now look at them." 5 massive wolves sat quietly around Brielle like obedient guards. Brielle finished feeding the last piece of bread. Then she stood. "Thank you," she told the wolves politely. The largest one wagged its tail. Magnus blinked. Rowan looked skyward. "We are all doomed." Inside the fortress, Nalia finally cleared her throat gently. "Princess, the Alpha King has prepared chambers for the child." Elsinore turned away from the window. "She is staying here." "Yes. Why?" Nalia hesitated again. "Because the Alpha King promised to help her find her father." Elsinore's eyes narrowed slightly. The ruthless conqueror of 3 territories, helping a child search for her father. The idea sounded almost ridiculous. Yet the sight she had just witnessed in the courtyard told a different story. The man she expected to meet was a monster, but the one she saw below looked different. At that moment, a sudden burst of laughter echoed up from the courtyard. Elsinore glanced back outside. Brielle had climbed onto Alaric's shoulders. The Alpha King stood patiently while the small girl balanced there like she had done it her entire life. Across the courtyard, Rowan whispered to Magnus, "That man conquered 3 kingdoms." Magnus nodded. "Yes." Rowan gestured toward the sight before them. "And now he is a walking ladder." Elsinore could not stop the quiet breath of amusement that escaped her. The sight was absurd. The most feared Alpha in the north stood patiently while a child rode on his shoulders. Brielle spotted the princess on the balcony. Her eyes brightened. She waved enthusiastically. "Princess," she called. Elsinore froze slightly. The child pointed down at Alaric. "Do you want a turn?" The courtyard erupted with laughter. Even several hardened warriors doubled over trying to contain themselves. Magnus leaned against a pillar. "I am never going to recover from this day." Alaric Stormclaw looked up toward the balcony. His green eyes met Elsinore's. For a moment the noise of the courtyard faded. The winter wind moved gently through the open stone arches. Elsinore studied the man who had conquered her kingdom. He studied her in return. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no cruelty, only quiet strength, and something else, something she could not yet name. Then Brielle tugged on his hair. "Careful," she warned him. "My ladder is moving." The moment broke. Elsinore turned away from the balcony, but a strange thought followed her as she walked deeper into the hall. Perhaps the man she had sworn to hate was not the monster she believed him to be. And in the courtyard below, Brielle Stormleaf continued laughing with a pack of wolves that obeyed her as if she had always been their queen. Morning arrived slowly over Ironhowl Fortress. Thin winter sunlight slid across the mountain walls and spilled into the courtyard where the fortress wolves usually trained. The air smelled of cold stone, pine smoke, and iron. Most mornings began with shouting, warriors drilling, wolves running through formation exercises. But this morning something unusual had replaced the noise. Quiet. A strange, respectful quiet. Rowan Frostborn stopped halfway through the training yard and stared. Across the stone courtyard, Brielle Stormleaf sat cross-legged beside the wolf kennels. 5 enormous battle wolves sat calmly around her, not resting, not sleeping, sitting, watching her as if awaiting instructions. Rowan rubbed his eyes. Silas stepped beside him. "Is she doing it again?" Rowan nodded slowly. "Yes." Dorian folded his arms. "I told you something strange was happening." Magnus Blackmore joined them and sighed heavily. "We train those wolves every day," Silas muttered. For 8 years. Brielle held a small wooden bowl in her lap. Inside it was warm porridge. She dipped a spoon and tasted it. Then she looked at the wolves. You cannot have this, she told them gently. It is too hot. The wolves waited patiently. Rowan leaned toward Magnus. They understand her. Magnus nodded. Yes. Rowan exhaled slowly. That is deeply concerning. The largest wolf shifted closer. Brielle looked at him. I said wait. The wolf stopped moving immediately. Silas groaned softly. I once tried that command. Dorian shook his head. They chased you into the stables. Silas crossed his arms. That was a misunderstanding. Across the courtyard, Brielle finished her porridge. She wiped her mouth carefully with her sleeve. Then she pointed toward the kennel gates. All right, she announced. You may go now. The wolves stood. They trotted back toward their pens without a single command from the trainers. Rowan stared in disbelief. Magnus leaned against the wall. I feel unnecessary. At that moment, Brielle stood and brushed snow from her cloak. Then she walked toward the fortress doors. The wolves followed her, all 5 of them. Rowan groaned. Oh no. Inside the fortress halls, servants rushed around preparing the morning meals. When Brielle entered, the wolves padded calmly behind her like a moving mountain of fur. One servant dropped an entire tray of cups. Another climbed onto a table. Nalia hurried forward quickly. Oh no, 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 no. She crouched beside Brielle. Little one, wolves are not allowed in the dining hall. Brielle turned around. The wolves stared back at her. You must wait outside, she explained politely. The wolves sat immediately, directly outside the doors. Rowan appeared a moment later and nearly collapsed against the wall. Good, he whispered. Very good. Magnus shook his head. We have lost control of the wolves. Inside the hall, Brielle noticed something new. A massive golden tub sat near the hearth. Steam drifted from its surface. She stopped walking. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. Nalia smiled. That is for you. Brielle pointed carefully. Is it soup? Several servants choked on their laughter. No, Nalia said gently. It is a bath. Brielle stepped closer and peered into the steaming water. Rich people are very strange, she whispered. Across the room, Princess Elsinore Nightvale watched the scene. Her lips pressed together as she tried to maintain composure. Brielle leaned toward her. Do you bathe in soup too? Elsinore finally laughed. A soft, unexpected sound. No, she replied. It is not soup. Brielle studied the tub again. It looks like soup. Later that morning, the fortress buzzed with rumors. The Alpha King had returned with a mysterious child. The wolves obeyed her. And now the entire fortress had heard about the royal soup bath. Meanwhile, in the council chamber, Alaric Stormclaw sat at the long stone table reviewing war reports. Rowan stood beside him. Magnus leaned against a pillar. Lucian studied a map spread across the table. The Thornridge Patrol reports nothing unusual, Lucian said. Blackmore envoys arrive tomorrow. Alaric nodded once. Good. Before anyone could continue, the council doors burst open. Brielle walked inside. Behind her followed 5 enormous wolves. Rowan covered his face immediately. Magnus whispered, This cannot be real. Brielle crossed the room. You forgot lunch. Rowan blinked. We are discussing military strategy. Brielle placed a wooden tray on the table. You can discuss it after you eat. Alaric looked down at the bread and stew, then back at Brielle. A strange silence filled the council chamber. Lucian cleared his throat carefully. Technically, he said, she is correct. Rowan sighed deeply. Alaric leaned back in his chair. Council adjourned. Magnus muttered under his breath. The Royal Omega has spoken. Brielle smiled proudly. Meanwhile, Princess Elsinore watched all of this from the upper gallery. Her thoughts were complicated. This was the same Alpha King she had sworn to hate, the conqueror of Nightvale, the warrior who ended the war. Yet the man she watched now allowed a small girl to interrupt his war council with lunch, allowed wolves to follow her through the fortress, allowed laughter to exist in a place once ruled only by discipline and fear. Later that afternoon, Elsinore walked through the fortress gardens. Snow had begun melting slowly along the stone paths. She paused beside a frozen fountain. Footsteps approached behind her. She did not need to turn. She recognized the quiet weight of them. Alaric Stormclaw stopped beside her. For a moment neither spoke. A cold wind drifted through the garden. Elsinore finally said, The wolves follow her everywhere. Yes, and you do nothing to stop it. No. Elsinore turned slightly toward him. Why? Alaric's voice was quiet. My wolf will not allow it. Elsinore studied his face carefully. Your wolf obeys the child. Alaric looked toward the courtyard where Brielle laughed with the wolves. Yes. Elsinore followed his gaze. Something ancient stirred beneath the calm surface of the fortress. Something none of them yet understood. and deep within the mountain halls of Ironhowl, the fate of the northern wolf territories was already beginning to shift. Even if no one realized it yet, winter loosened its grip slowly across Ironhowl Fortress. The snow along the lower stone walls had begun melting, leaving narrow streams trickling through the courtyard, but inside the fortress halls, a colder tension had begun to grow. Not everyone welcomed the strange warmth that Brielle Stormleaf had brought with her, and one person in particular watched the change with quiet displeasure. Queen Mother Myra Wolfsbane stood at the upper balcony, overlooking the training yard. Her posture was perfectly straight, her silver hair was braided tightly behind her head, her eyes, sharp and calculating, moved slowly across the courtyard below. Warriors trained with swords, battle wolves ran through drills, and near the center of it all, Brielle Stormleaf sat comfortably on the ground. 6 wolves surrounded her now. Not 5. 6. The Queen Mother's fingers tightened slightly around the stone railing. "This cannot continue," she said quietly. Behind her stood Kale, one of the fortress guards. "The wolves seem fond of the child," he said carefully. Myra did not look at him. "The wolves are weapons," she replied coldly. "They are not pets." Below them, Brielle held a wooden brush in her hand. The enormous wolves sat patiently while she brushed their thick winter fur. One of them rolled onto its back happily. Kale cleared his throat. "They do seem calm." Myra's eyes narrowed. "Wolves of Ironhowl do not become calm. They become obedient, controlled, disciplined, not affectionate." Across the courtyard, Rowan Frostborn approached the scene cautiously. "Morning, Brielle." "Good morning," Brielle replied brightly. Rowan looked at the wolves. "Are they behaving?" Brielle nodded seriously. "They are very polite." Rowan rubbed his forehead. Magnus Blackmore walked past them carrying a training spear. He stopped, stared, then shook his head. "We used to have a system," he muttered. Nearby, Dorian leaned toward Silas. "I think the system is gone." Silas nodded slowly. "Completely gone." Inside the fortress, another scene unfolded. Princess Elsinore Nightvale walked through the long stone corridor leading toward the council chambers. Servants bowed respectfully as she passed. But her thoughts were elsewhere. For days she had watched the strange changes spreading through Ironhowl. Warriors laughed more easily. The wolves wandered freely around the fortress instead of remaining chained to the kennels, and Alaric Stormclaw himself seemed different, less distant, less cold. She turned a corner and stopped suddenly. Inside the chamber ahead sat the Alpha King. Brielle stood behind him on a chair. Her small hands worked carefully through his long dark hair. "Do not move," she instructed firmly. Alaric remained perfectly still. "I am not moving." Rowan stood nearby, trying very hard not to laugh. Magnus leaned against the wall, looking deeply concerned for the dignity of the kingdom. Elsinore stepped quietly into the doorway. "What is happening here?" Brielle glanced over. "Oh good," she said. "Princess, tell him to sit still." Elsinore blinked. "Why?" "Because his hair looks like a wolf nest." Rowan coughed loudly. Magnus turned away and pretended to examine the wall. Alaric's voice remained calm. "It does not look like a wolf nest." Brielle held up a tangled lock of hair. "Yes, it does." Elsinore felt something unfamiliar tug at the corner of her mouth. A smile. 10 minutes later, the Alpha King of Ironhowl still sat perfectly still while Brielle finished her work. She tied the final braid with a small ribbon. "There," she said proudly. "Now you look respectable." Rowan looked up slowly. Magnus closed his eyes. Silas whispered from the hallway. "The king has been braided." Elsinore stepped closer and studied the result. The braids were uneven. One leaned slightly to the left, another hung lower than the rest, but somehow the effect did not diminish the Alpha King's authority. It made him look human. Elsinore met his eyes. For a moment the world narrowed to the quiet space between them. "You allowed this," she said softly. Alaric's voice was calm. She seemed determined. Brielle crossed her arms proudly. "I fixed it." Rowan sighed. Yes, you did." Later that afternoon, another person had begun asking questions. Deep within the fortress library, Rhea Ashford carefully turned the pages of an ancient book. Rhea served as the fortress historian. She knew the records of the wolf territories better than anyone alive, and something about Brielle troubled her, not in a dangerous way, in a familiar way. She had watched the wolves obey the child. I watched the Alpha King kneel on the road, watched the fortress slowly shift around her presence. Now she searched the oldest records of wolf history. The pages were brittle with age, ink faded by centuries. One passage caught her attention. Her finger paused over the text. She read the words slowly, then read them again. Her breath caught. "Impossible," she whispered. At that moment, Rowan entered the library. You asked to see me? Rhea closed the book slowly. Yes. Rowan stepped forward. What did you find? Rhea looked toward the window overlooking the courtyard. Below them, Brielle ran across the snow with a pack of wolves chasing happily behind her. Something ancient, Rhea said quietly. Something the wolf kingdoms have not seen in centuries. Rowan frowned. What are you talking about? Rhea rested her hand gently on the old book. I am not certain yet. But if I am right, her eyes returned to the child laughing with the wolves. The girl you brought into this fortress may be far more important than any of us realize. Outside in the courtyard, Brielle tripped suddenly in the snow. One of the wolves rushed forward to steady her. She laughed and wrapped her arms around its neck. High above the courtyard walls, the wind carried the sound of distant mountain wolves howling, a call echoing across the valleys, a call that seemed to answer something ancient waking within the fortress itself. And far below the stone halls of Ironhowl, a truth buried in the oldest records of wolf history was slowly rising to the surface. Before we continue, let me ask you something. If you were standing where Brielle stood that day, freezing, hungry, and completely alone, would you have had the courage to walk up to the most feared Alpha King in the North and ask him for help? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if you're enjoying Brielle's story so far, don't forget to subscribe to Ella's Alpha Romance, like the video, and share this story with another werewolf romance fan. Alright, now let's return to Ironhowl Fortress, because the moment that will change everything is about to happen. The first truly warm day of late winter arrived under a pale sky. It was not spring yet, not properly. The wind still carried teeth when it came down from the frost-born peaks, and snow remained packed in the shadowed corners of the fortress walls. But the air had changed enough for everyone to feel it. Water dripped from stone ledges, the training yard no longer crunched under every step, and somewhere in the lower gardens, a bird risked a song. Brielle noticed all of it. She noticed everything. That morning she woke before the bells, and sat cross-legged in the wide bed that still felt too soft to belong to her. A fire burned low in the hearth. One of the fortress wolves slept across the doorway like a living rug, his tail twitching in dreams. Brielle slipped out from beneath the blankets and padded across the floor. She paused at the wolf. I am going to find breakfast, she whispered. The wolf opened one eye. You may come, she added generously. The eye closed again. Brielle nodded. That is wise. You are very large. People may think you are stealing pastries. By the time she reached the lower hall, the fortress was beginning to wake. Servants hurried between kitchens and storage rooms. Armor rang faintly from the outer yard. Somewhere in the distance, Rowan's voice barked an order at a line of half-awake warriors. Nalia spotted Brielle first. You are awake early. I was hungry. That is a reasonable explanation. Brielle took the warm bread Nalia handed her and bit into it at once. Heat spread through her chest. For a child who had spent days on a frozen roadside, the fortress still felt like magic in certain moments. Bread when she was hungry, blankets when she was cold, people who looked directly at her when they spoke. It was while carrying a second piece of bread toward the training yard that she heard the sound. A crack. Sharp, violent, not a sword, not wood splitting, something worse. Brielle stopped walking. Another crack followed, then a small stifled sound, like someone trying very hard not to cry out. The bread cooled in her hand. She knew that sound. Not from this place, from before. From the years when winter had been long and tempers in hungry villages had turned hard and mean. From alleys where small people learned to stay out of the way. Brielle moved toward the sound at once. The corridor narrowed into a side arch she had never entered before. Cold air spilled through it. Beyond lay a smaller yard enclosed by high walls. Not a training space, not a garden, a place meant to be hidden from the rest of the fortress. 3 guards stood there. A boy barely older than Brielle hung with his wrists tied high to a wooden post. His back was bare, thin, already striped red. A 4th guard held a whip. Brielle froze. The boy's head was bowed, his jaw tight, his bare feet shaking against the wet stone. A woman stood nearby in dark winter silk, trimmed with silver fur. Queen Mother, Myra Wolfsbane. She watched the scene without expression. Again, she said. The whip rose. Brielle moved before anyone could stop her. No, her voice cracked across the yard. Every head turned. The whip paused in the air. The Queen Mother's eyes narrowed, as Brielle ran straight across the stone and planted herself in front of the boy with both arms spread wide. No, Brielle said again, breathless now. You must not. For one stunned second, no one moved. Then Myra spoke, calm and cold. Remove her. The nearest guard stepped forward hesitantly. Brielle looked up at him with such fierce outrage that he actually slowed. "He is hurt," she said. "Can you not see that?" "Child," Myra said, "this does not concern you." Brielle turned toward her. The Queen Mother stood elegant and unmoved, one gloved hand resting lightly over the other. She looked exactly as she always did. Perfect, controlled, impossible to read. Brielle had never liked the way her smile never reached her eyes. "It concerns me," Brielle said. "You are hurting him. He failed in his duties." So, the guards blinked. Even the servant boy raised his head a little. Mira's expression thinned. So discipline must be maintained. Brielle stared at her, as if she had said something deeply foolish. "He is already sorry," Brielle said. "Look at him." The boy's face had gone white. Sweat stood along his brow despite the cold. He could not have been more than 12. Myra's gaze shifted to the whip again. "Proceed." The guard lifted his arm. Brielle planted her feet harder and raised her chin. "If you hit him, you will hit me." Silence dropped over the yard. No one breathed. Then another voice entered the space. "What is happening here?" The temperature in the yard seemed to change. The guards stepped back at once. Brielle turned. Alaric Stormclaw was striding through the archway with Rowan at one side and Magnus at the other. He had clearly come from the training ground. His dark hair was loose from exercise, and the expression on his face was not loud. It did not need to be. Stillness spread from him like a blade laid flat across the throat of the world. His gaze took in everything at once. The boy tied to the post, the whip in the guard's hand, Brielle standing between them. His mother watched from the side. When his eyes reached Brielle, something dangerous flashed through them. Not anger at her, but something darker at the sight of where she stood. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides. "Come here," he said quietly. Brielle shook her head. "Not until they stop." A lesser king might have argued. Alaric did not. He looked at the guard holding the whip. "Drop it." The whip hit the stone immediately. The crack of leather against the ground echoed like a gunshot in the silence. Myra drew herself up. "This does not concern the throne." The boy stole food from the lower kitchens. The servant boy made a broken sound. "I took 1 loaf, Your Majesty." "My little sister." "Silence," snapped one of the guards. Alaric's head turned so sharply the man paled at once. "No one in my fortress will silence the truth while I am asking for it." The boy swallowed hard. "My little sister has a fever. She would not eat broth. I thought bread might." He stopped, trembling. Brielle looked from the boy to Alaric. Her eyes were wide and furious and full all at once. "He was trying to feed someone," she said. "That is not wicked." Myra's voice sharpened. "Mercy without order is weakness." Alaric finally turned to face her. For a moment mother and son looked at one another across the yard, and everyone else became almost irrelevant. Myra had ruled the fortress in his father's long absences. She had kept discipline through fear, precision, and a belief that softness invited ruin. Many still listened to her as if her word carried the old law itself. But this was not the old law, and Alaric was no longer the son who returned from battle to be judged by what he failed to crush. His voice, when it came, was low and absolute. "Weakness is a fortress that beats starving children for hunger." The words landed harder than a shout. Myra went still. The servant boy looked as if he had forgotten how to stand. Brielle's shoulders eased just a fraction. Alaric stepped forward and untied the boy himself. The ropes dropped away. The child sagged. Rowan lunged in time to catch him before he struck the stone. "Get him to the healers," Alaric ordered. Magnus was already moving. "Yes, my king." The guard stood frozen. Myra's composure returned in a colder form. "You undermine discipline in front of servants and soldiers alike." Alaric faced the yard. Not just his mother. Everyone. His voice carried, calm and clear. "Hear me now. No one in this fortress will ever be whipped again." The words seemed to ring against the walls. One servant near the arch made a small choking sound. Another covered her mouth with both hands. Rowan straightened slowly, still supporting the injured boy. Even he looked surprised, though not displeased. Myra's eyes flashed. "You would overturn tradition for a single incident." Alaric did not raise his voice. "I would overturn cruelty whenever I find it wearing the mask of tradition." Brielle stared up at him. Something in her face softened so suddenly it nearly undid him. The yard had gone so quiet that the dripping meltwater from the eaves could be heard striking the ground. Then Brielle moved. She stepped away from the post and threw both arms around Alaric's waist. He went perfectly still. Rowan looked away immediately, perhaps to preserve the dignity of the crown. Magnus, returning from the arch after shouting for a healer, did the same. Several guards seemed unsure whether they were allowed to witness this. Brielle hugged him as tightly as she could. "You're a hero," she whispered. The words were small. They struck like a spear. For a heartbeat, Alaric could not answer. He had been called many things in his life: conqueror, butcher, Alpha King, ruthless, necessary. Not that, not a hero, especially not by someone whose father had marched to war under banners he commanded. He lowered one hand very carefully to the back of Brielle's head, and for the first time in years, something inside him that had been hard for so long it no longer felt living, gave way, not fully, not enough to heal, but enough to ache, enough to let light reach it. Across the yard, Elsinore Nightvale stood in the archway. She had arrived moments earlier and witnessed the final exchange without making a sound. Her gaze moved from Brielle to Alaric, to the whip lying abandoned on the stone. She had expected arrogance from him, expected coldness, brutal practicality, the same remorseless certainty she had imagined on the battlefield. Instead, she had seen a king choose mercy in front of his court, his guards and his own mother. Her breath left her slowly. He felt her watching and looked up. Their eyes met across the yard. No one spoke, but something shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something quieter. The first fracture in certainty. The first dangerous place where hatred could no longer rest as cleanly as before. Myra noticed that look. Her mouth thinned. Without another word, she turned and swept from the yard, silk whispering across wet stone. The guards followed her in uneasy silence. The servant boy was carried away toward the healer's wing, trembling but alive, and the yard emptied in ripples. Only a few remained. Brielle finally released Alaric and stepped back enough to study his face. "You did the right thing," she said gravely. He looked down at her. "I should have known it was happening." She considered this. Then she reached for his hand and squeezed it with surprising firmness. "You know now." It was such a child's answer. So simple, so impossible to argue with. At the archway, Elsinore turned to go, then hesitated. She looked back once more at the man in the yard, the feared Alpha King standing in late winter light, a child at his side, his mother's old cruelty broken beneath a new law, and she realized with a chill far more unsettling than mountain wind that the most dangerous thing about Alaric Stormclaw might not be his strength. It might be that he was changing, and some part of her was beginning to hope that change was real. By evening, the entire fortress knew. No one in Ironhowl would ever be whipped again. Servants whispered it in kitchens. Warriors repeated it in the barracks. The words traveled faster than fire. Some approved, some did not. But no one questioned whether the order would stand. The Alpha King himself had spoken it. And deep in the old library, where candles burned low over dust and forgotten histories, Rhea Ashford paused over a page of ancient wolf law and lifted her head as if she had felt the fortress shift around her, because it had. A child had stepped between power and pain. A king had chosen what kind of ruler he wished to be, and the story that had begun on a frozen roadside had just crossed its first true threshold. Late winter settled heavily over Ironhowl Fortress. The winds from the frost-born mountains no longer cut quite as sharply as they had weeks before, yet the cold still clung to the stone walls like an old memory that refused to fade. Inside the fortress library, candles burned long into the evening, scrolls lay open across a wide oak table, ink-stained pages of battle reports covered nearly every surface. War had ended, but war left echoes, and those echoes lived in records. Rowan Frostborn stood near the table reading through a parchment that had clearly traveled a long and difficult road to reach the fortress. Snow still clung to the edge of the rolled paper. Beside him, Magnus Blackmore leaned against a tall bookcase, arms crossed. Lucian paced slowly across the room. Alaric Stormclaw stood at the window. He had been standing there for nearly an hour, looking out over the courtyard, looking toward the distant road beyond the fortress gates, the road that led to Thornridge Pass, the road where a child had been waiting. Rowan finally broke the silence. Another batch of records arrived this morning. Alaric did not turn. From Thornridge? Yes. Rowan unrolled the parchment fully and scanned the list. The last units returning from the eastern flank. Lucian stopped pacing. Any mention of Stormleaf? Rowan continued reading. For weeks now they had searched every war record available. The name Brielle had spoken on the frozen road had become an anchor in Alaric's mind. Stormleaf. He had commanded thousands of soldiers during the war. Hundreds of names passed through reports every week. But this one mattered. Because somewhere in Ironhowl Fortress, a child still believed her father would return, and Alaric had promised to help her find him. Rowan's eyes moved down the parchment slowly. Magnus watched his expression carefully. Then Rowan stopped. He did not speak immediately. Magnus straightened. "Well?" Rowan exhaled slowly. "I found it." The room fell silent. Alaric finally turned from the window. Read it. Rowan's voice lowered slightly. "Final battle report. Thornridge Pass. The words seemed to weigh heavier with each line. Enemy forces attempted a night assault on the western ridge. Lucien frowned. That was the assassination attempt. Rowan nodded once. Yes. He continued reading. A hostile infiltrator reached the Alpha command line. The candlelight flickered across the parchment. Rowan's jaw tightened. A soldier intercepted the attack. Magnus leaned forward slightly. Name. Rowan swallowed once before speaking. Stormleaf. The word hung in the air like a stone dropped into deep water. No one spoke. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Lucien rubbed his temple. I remember that night. Magnus nodded slowly. The assassin came through the chaos after the third breach. Lucien looked toward Alaric. You nearly died. Alaric's expression did not change, but the air around him grew still. Rowan continued quietly. The soldier stepped between the blade and the Alpha King. He lowered the parchment slightly. The report says the strike was fatal. Silence filled the room. Outside the library windows, snow began falling again. Soft flakes drifted down across the fortress courtyard. Magnus broke the silence first. So Brielle's father. Rowan nodded once. Yes. Lucien let out a slow breath. He saved the king. Alaric looked down at the parchment in Rowan's hands. His voice was almost calm. Where was the body taken? Rowan checked the report again. It was buried with the fallen soldiers near Thornridge Pass. The Alpha King closed his eyes briefly. A memory returned with sudden clarity. The chaos of battle. Steel flashing through torchlight. A soldier stepped forward without hesitation. The shock of impact. Then darkness. He had never known the name. Now he did. Stormleaf. Across the fortress at that same moment, Brielle Stormleaf sat in the courtyard with the wolves. Spring had not yet arrived, but the snow along the edges of the stone had begun to melt. Small rivulets of water ran across the ground. Brielle held a wooden stick and drew lines in the wet earth. One of the wolves rested his enormous head beside her knee. You are very heavy, she informed him. The wolf blinked slowly. Across the courtyard, Rowan appeared with Magnus behind him. They paused when they saw the scene. 6 wolves sat quietly around Brielle like a silent guard. Magnus rubbed his chin. We should be alarmed. Rowan nodded. Yes, but we are mostly confused. Brielle looked up when they approached. Hello. Rowan crouched beside her. Brielle, can I ask you something? Yes. Do you remember what your father looked like? Brielle's face brightened. Of course. What color was his hair? Brown. His eyes? Blue. Magnus leaned slightly closer. Was he tall? Brielle nodded enthusiastically. Yes. Then she paused thoughtfully. Not as tall as Alaric. Magnus smiled faintly. That narrows it down. Rowan hesitated. The words felt heavy in his chest, but he could not say them. Not yet. Alaric needed to be the one. Rowan stood slowly. Thank you, Brielle. Brielle watched them walk away. Then she returned to drawing in the wet ground. One of the wolves nudged her hand gently. Inside the fortress library, Rhea Ashford sat surrounded by ancient texts. The candlelight flickered across a single page she had been studying for hours. The words written there were older than Ironhowl itself, older than the fortress, older than the kingdoms. Her finger traced a faded symbol on the page, a mark representing a wolf standing beside a smaller figure, a figure crowned not with authority, but with balance. Rhea whispered the words quietly. Royal Omega. Footsteps approached behind her. Alaric Stormclaw entered the library. Rhea turned. You found the war record. It was not a question. Alaric nodded once. Yes. Rhea studied his face. Then you know what the soldier did. I do. A long silence passed. Then Rhea turned the ancient book toward him. The wolves obey the child. Alaric said nothing. The wolves obey you as well. Rhea continued. But not like this. She tapped the page gently. There are records of wolves responding this way before. Alaric's gaze moved to the text. Centuries ago. Rhea nodded. The presence of a royal Omega changes wolves. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes carried quiet gravity. They do not command wolves. They balance them. Alaric looked through the window toward the courtyard. Below, Brielle laughed as one of the wolves tried to steal her stick. Rhea followed his gaze. If other territories learn about this child, her voice softened. They will not see a girl. They will see power. Alaric said nothing, but the weight of the truth settled across his shoulders. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside Ironhowl Fortress, 2 secrets had finally surfaced. A soldier named Stormleaf had died saving the Alpha King, and the child waiting for him carried a bloodline lost to wolf history. Both truths were moving slowly toward the same moment, a moment that would break Brielle's heart and change the fate of the wolf kingdoms forever. Spring tried to arrive, but the mountains were not ready to release winter yet. Cold winds still swept across the cliffs surrounding Ironhowl Fortress, carrying with them the smell of melting snow and pine forests waking slowly beneath frost. In the lower courtyard, Brielle Stormleaf had discovered a new game. She was attempting to balance across the edge of the stone fountain, while 3 fortress wolves watched with deep concern. "You must not fall," she told them. The wolves followed her carefully as she stepped along the edge. "If I fall, you must catch me." Rowan Frostborn stood nearby with Magnus Blackmore. Rowan rubbed the back of his neck. "Do wolves catch children?" Magnus considered this thoughtfully. "I suppose we will find out." At that moment, a shadow fell across the courtyard. Brielle turned. Alaric Stormclaw stood at the entrance to the garden. His expression was calm, but something about the stillness in his shoulders made Rowan straighten. Magnus recognized it too. That was the look Alaric carried before a battle. Rowan stepped forward. "Should we?" "No," Alaric said quietly. His eyes remained on Brielle. "I will speak with her alone." Rowan nodded once and gestured for the warriors to leave the courtyard. Even the wolves seemed to sense the shift in the air. They moved slowly away and settled near the fountain. Brielle hopped down from the stone edge and ran toward Alaric. "Look," she said proudly. "I did not fall." Alaric studied her for a long moment. Then he knelt. The movement was slow, careful, almost deliberate. Brielle tilted her head. "You are kneeling again." "Yes." "Is your wolf doing it?" A faint breath escaped him. "No." "Then why?" Alaric looked at the ground for a moment. The stone beneath them still carried faint patches of snow where the sunlight had not yet reached. "I need to tell you something about your father." Brielle's smile faded slightly. "Oh." She sat down in front of him without hesitation, folding her legs beneath her. The wolves watched quietly from the edge of the courtyard. Alaric rested one arm across his knee. "I found the war records." Brielle nodded eagerly. "That is good." Her eyes shone with simple hope. "Did you find him?" The question landed like a blade. Alaric Stormclaw had faced armies without hesitation. He had commanded battles that decided the fate of kingdoms. Yet in that moment, speaking to a child barely 10 winters old, he felt something far heavier than war pressing against his chest. He did not rush the words. There was a battle near Thornridge Pass. Brielle listened carefully. The enemy attempted a surprise attack during the night. The wind moved gently through the courtyard trees. An assassin reached my command line. Brielle frowned slightly. "That sounds dangerous." It was. Alaric's voice remained steady, but a soldier stepped forward. Brielle leaned closer. He stopped the assassin. Her eyes brightened. "That sounds like my papa." Alaric's throat tightened slightly. "Yes." He stepped between the blade and me. The courtyard grew very quiet. Even the wolves had stopped moving. "The strike was meant for me." Brielle waited. Her small hands rested on her knees. "And my father stopped it," she said. "Yes." Brielle smiled again. "Then he is a hero." Alaric held her gaze. "He died protecting me." The words hung in the air like falling snow. For a moment, Brielle did not move. The meaning moved slowly through her thoughts. Her father had been strong, brave, careful, but war was dangerous. Even heroes sometimes. She looked down at the stone between them. "Oh." The single word was soft, not angry, not loud, just small. Alaric remained kneeling. He did not look away. He did not hide from the truth. "Your father gave his life so I could keep mine." Brielle's fingers curled slightly against her dress. "My papa promised he would come back." "I know." The wind moved again. A wolf shifted quietly behind them. Brielle wiped her nose with her sleeve. "My papa never breaks promises." Alaric nodded slowly. "That is true." Brielle looked up. Confusion flickered across her face. "But he did." "No." Alaric's voice remained calm. "He kept his promise." Brielle blinked. "How?" Alaric rested one hand gently against the ground beside her. "Your father knew something most soldiers did not." Brielle waited. "When wars end," he continued quietly, "my army always returns through Thornridge Pass." Understanding moved slowly through her expression. "He told you to wait on that road," Alaric said, "because he knew if anything happened to him, I would find you." Brielle stared at him. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Wait on that road. I will always find you." Her lower lip trembled. "Oh," the word came again, but this time something deeper lived inside it. Grief, understanding, and a strange kind of pride. "My papa was very clever." "Yes." Brielle looked toward the mountains beyond the fortress walls. "He made sure someone strong would help me." Alaric's voice softened. "He made sure I would." Brielle sat quietly for a long time. The wolves remained still beside the fountain. Finally she spoke again. You said he saved you. Yes. Brielle considered this carefully. Then you must take very good care of the life he gave you. Alaric blinked. The wisdom inside the child's voice struck him harder than any blade. Brielle reached forward suddenly and hugged him, her arms wrapped tightly around his shoulders. You must not waste it, she said firmly. Alaric froze. Then slowly his arms moved around her. Not as a king, not as a warrior, as a man honoring the daughter of the soldier who had died for him. I will not. High above the courtyard windows, another pair of eyes had witnessed everything. Princess Elsinore Nightvale stood on the balcony overlooking the garden. She had come only moments earlier, but she had heard enough. Her heart twisted unexpectedly. The ruthless Alpha King of Ironhowl kneeling before a child again, not because instinct demanded it, because respect did, because the daughter of a fallen soldier deserved nothing less. Elsinore rested her hand against the cold stone railing. The man she had sworn to hate stood below her holding a grieving child with the gentleness of someone who understood loss too well. Something inside her certainty cracked a little more, and somewhere deep within the fortress library, Rhea Ashford closed the ancient book slowly. The truth had finally taken shape. The wolves obeyed Brielle because they recognized something older than alpha authority, something written into wolf blood itself. The child carried the ancient balance of the royal Omega, and that truth was about to change everything. Spring finally broke the back of winter. It did not arrive suddenly. The mountains never allowed that. Instead, the season came slowly, patiently, the way a tired kingdom begins to breathe again after war. The snow along the lower cliffs melted first. Thin streams of water slid down the rock faces and gathered in silver ribbons across the valley below, Ironhowl Fortress. The wolves noticed it before the people did. They lifted their noses toward the wind. They moved through the fortress courtyard with a restless energy, as if the earth itself was waking beneath their paws. Inside the fortress, life was changing as well. Servants who once moved quickly through the halls with lowered eyes now paused to talk with one another. Soldiers who had spent 3 years fighting now laughed more easily during training, and everywhere Brielle Stormleaf walked, the wolves followed. It had become so normal that few people even questioned it anymore. On one bright morning, Brielle ran through the training yard carrying a stick that one of the wolves desperately wanted. 6 enormous battle wolves chased her in a slow circle around the courtyard. Rowan Frostborn leaned against a wooden post watching the scene. Magnus Blackmore stood beside him. Rowan sighed. I trained those wolves for 8 years. Magnus nodded thoughtfully. And now they fetch sticks. Brielle stopped suddenly and held the stick up. You must sit. The wolves sat. Every single one of them. Magnus stared. Rowan rubbed his face. I believe we have lost control of the wolves. Across the courtyard, Princess Elsinore Nightvale stood on the balcony overlooking the training yard. She had been watching the strange scene unfold. The girl laughing with wolves, the warriors shaking their heads in disbelief, the Alpha King standing nearby with quiet amusement in his eyes. Elsinore had spent weeks observing the changes spreading through the fortress. They were subtle, but undeniable. The harsh tension that had once filled Ironhowl had softened. The fortress felt different, lighter, almost alive, and Brielle stood at the center of it. Behind Elsinore, footsteps approached quietly. Princess. She turned. Rhea Ashford entered the balcony chamber carrying a thick ancient book. Her expression was serious. You found something, Elsinore said. Rhea nodded slowly. Yes. She placed the book on the stone table and opened it carefully. The pages were old, very old. Symbols filled the parchment, images of wolves, and beside them, smaller figures standing among them. Elsinore studied the page. What am I looking at? Rhea rested her finger on one particular drawing. This is the oldest record we have of the royal Omega bloodline. Elsinore frowned. I thought those were myths. So did many historians, Rhea said quietly. But myths often begin as forgotten truths. Elsinore looked down at the courtyard again. Brielle now sat beside the fountain with 2 wolves resting their heads against her shoulders. She does not command them, Elsinore said slowly. No, Rhea agreed. She balances them. The words echoed softly in the stone chamber. Elsinore's gaze returned to the page. And you believe she carries this bloodline? I do. Rhea closed the book gently. The wolves recognized it the moment she entered the fortress. Elsinore's mind returned to the story she had heard earlier. The Alpha King kneeling on the frozen road. Not out of kindness, out of instinct. Because even the strongest alpha wolves obey the presence of a royal Omega. Down in the courtyard, Brielle noticed Alaric walking toward her. She waved happily. Look, she said proudly, pointing at the wolves. They are behaving. Alaric stopped beside her. Yes, they are very polite. I can see that. Brielle studied him carefully. You look serious. Alaric glanced toward the mountains. I am thinking, that is dangerous. Rowan overheard and nearly dropped the spear he was carrying. Magnus leaned against the wall, laughing quietly. Brielle crossed her arms. You must not think too much, she warned. Why? Because you forgot lunch. Rowan whispered to Magnus. The Royal Omega has spoken. Magnus nodded gravely. Across the courtyard, Elsinore descended the stone steps toward them. The sunlight caught in her dark hair as she approached. Alaric turned when he sensed her presence. Their eyes met. For weeks now, something quiet had been growing between them. Not suddenly, not loud, but steady. Elsinore stopped beside Brielle. You have gathered quite an army. Brielle looked at the wolves proudly. They are good listeners. One of the wolves wagged its tail. Elsinore turned toward Alaric. For a moment neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of melting snow through the courtyard. Finally she said softly, You are not the monster I thought you were. The words hung between them. Alaric's expression did not change, but something warm flickered behind his eyes. Only one person believed that from the beginning, he replied. He looked down at Brielle. The child was now attempting to braid a wolf's fur. Elsinore followed his gaze. Brielle laughed when the wolf sneezed loudly. The sound echoed across the courtyard. Elsinore felt something shift inside her chest. The hatred she had carried for so long had been built from war, from grief, from stories told by frightened survivors. But the man standing beside her now, the man who had ended the whipping in the fortress, the man who had knelt before a child to honor the sacrifice of her father, was not the monster she had imagined. Elsinore stepped slightly closer. Their hands brushed. Neither of them moved away. For a moment the world seemed to grow quiet around them. The wolves, the warriors, the wind across the mountains, everything faded into the background, and for the first time since the war began, hope entered Ironhowl Fortress, not through conquest, not through power, but through a freezing child who had once stood beside a lonely milestone and asked the most feared Alpha King in the north for help. Brielle looked up suddenly. You are both standing very close. Rowan coughed loudly. Magnus turned away again. Elsinore's cheeks warmed slightly. Alaric almost smiled. Above them, the wolves lifted their heads toward the mountains. Their voices rose together in a long, powerful howl, a call that echoed across Nightvale, Blackmoor, and the valleys beyond Thornridge Pass. A call announcing the beginning of something new, a kingdom no longer ruled by fear, but by balance. And at the center of that new world stood a small girl with red cheeks, messy braids, and 6 enormous wolves sitting patiently at her feet. If Brielle's story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to Ella's Alpha Romance, like the video, and leave a comment telling me your favorite moment from the story. Your support helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more powerful Alpha Romance stories filled with unforgettable characters and epic love stories. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next story.